for those of you who don't know Jen, I'll tell you a couple of things about her. She's been a science educator for more than 15 years, currently teaching AP Environmental Science and Earth Science at Southampton High School. And I'm sure she's had a very interesting end of year.
Yeah.
She'll maybe talk about it. With an academic background in marine science and decades of field work in the Long Island bioregion's ecosystems, Jen is currently a PhD student at Antioch University, where she's embarking on a project about the transformative and liberating potential of student-generated nature connection experiences. She integrates the historical, social, economic, and political environment in her classes with her students as they learn about how these topics integrate with the local natural environment and the interconnectedness of all systems that sustain life. Jen is at the end of a 4-year term as a New York State master teacher, working to develop teacher expertise in the areas of content, pedagogy, and student well-being. She also facilitates the Long Island Master Teacher Climate Change Professional Learning Team. Passionate about empowering students, teachers, and community members, she is a mindfulness instructor. She would have to be that to survive this rigorous life that she lives. A permaculture designer and a forest therapy guide. And so, by the way, we want to let you know, mark your calendars for November 14th. It's a Saturday, because there will be a virtual, what is it called, Jen?
A virtual forest therapy walk. So people can listen in on their phones while they're in their yards or at their window or out in nature and experience forest therapy.
This should be, we'll all be ready for this by November.
Exactly.
So we're all very grateful to you for being a friend of the library and for doing these talks for us. So I will say thank you on behalf of all of us. Okay.
And I'll also say thank you, because that really made me feel wonderful. Thank you so much, Penny. I really appreciate it. And also expressing some gratitude, not only to all of you to coming out here around dinner time. I also really want to acknowledge that I live in Southampton. And so where I'm coming from, this is Shinnecock land. So I also want to express my gratitude to the Shinnecock Nation, the people of the Shinnecock Nation, who have cared for this land for millennia, and to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and future. So like Penny said, I'm a high school teacher, and one of my main drivers is empowering students to make a positive impact in the world and on themselves and on each other. And teaching is this really highly reflective practice. So I'm always asking my students, and myself for that matter, to think like, how can I be the change that I want to see in the world? And that question has really led me on some really fascinating and meaningful journeys. And one of which is the transformation of my yard from a typical suburban lawn into a food forest, which is of course what you're here for tonight. So before I begin, and while I'm putting up my slideshow, I'm wondering if you all have access to the chat, because I'm really curious about what brought you here tonight and what you're hoping to get from this talk. So if, you know, I don't know if you're on your phone or if you're on a computer, if you can just kind of type in the chat a few words about why you're here, because then that'll plant a little seed in my mind and I can sort of integrate that into my talk. So just wait if people can access that. Can people access the chat?
I think they can. Yes, it's one of the options on the bottom on your toolbar, where you can, the first option is to mute yourself. You can stop and start your video. And then the fifth one is the chat.
Okay.
So that's how you do it.
Chat.
Can you all see my screen?
Okay. Yeah.
Right now? Oops,
Yes.
that's,
Yes.
you know what though? It's like moving on its own. Hold on for a sec. Let me just go back to the beginning here. Oh, okay, so there are some people who participated in the chat. Okay. Oh, planning a new landscape for next spring. This is a great time to think about that. Better citizen for the climate, so fantastic way to engage with the environment. Okay, curiosity, native plants for the yard, and food for my window boxes. Okay, so that's wonderful. Thank you all. All right, so let me just get that going there. So, so you can see the presentation, right? I know I asked you this already, but
Yes.
okay, great. All right, so the program that is in the library, it says Yard to Food Forest. And as I was putting this presentation together, and I'll freely admit that I was terribly procrastinating on this and thinking, you know, what is this really about? Like, what does that mean to convert my yard to a food forest? And I was trying to think of the underlying issues. And really, it's about strengthening or partnering or connecting more with nature, and how when we do that, that yields this abundance of food or beauty, and really changes a lot about our lives. So originally I was thinking, okay, people will be growing like lots of food and want to, you know, create a food forest like I do, but I'd really like to invite you to think about creating a new type of relationship with the nature that's around you. So for tonight, I'm going to show you a bit of how to create a food forest, and you can see a bit of my yard behind me. So first, what is a food forest? Sometimes that's called an edible forest garden. Then I'm going to go on to share the many personal and environmental benefits of creating an edible forest garden. And then after that, I'm going to show you how you can begin to partner with nature in designing your food forest. And then lastly, I'm going to show you how I actually take you through the process of how I created my edible forest garden, which is now a few years old. So this is a picture from one of my teachers, Eric Tonesmeyer. He wrote Edible Forest Gardens, and at the end of the presentation, there's a whole list of references, and a few of you said that you were interested in incorporating some of this into your yard, so that bibliography at the end is going to be very, very helpful to you. So food forests are sometimes called edible forest gardens. They're a type of permaculture, and permaculture is a word that combines permanent and culture, and it was coined by Bill Mullinson, and he was one of the founders of the permaculture movement, and he describes it as conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems which have the diversity and resilience of natural ecosystems. It is the harmonious integration of landscape and people, providing their food, energy, shelter, and other non-material and material needs in a sustainable way. So it's a really interesting way to design and relate to the land that has a long history in many, many cultures. And so what you're doing in this is you're designing using the principles of ecology and evolution. And it's a bit like creating your own little world that world then changes and adapts over time, just as the real world does in fact do. So it's like you set up this, this system, and then it changes in response to you and the environment around it. So it's a very, very interesting landscape to create, but it's an also interesting way to change your relationship with the natural environment. And so it's important to remember that humans have long modified nature to help sustain our cultures. And in the past, so we've modified nature to sustain our cultures in the past, but also many indigenous cultures today. That change was cooperative. So you had humans and nature generally mutually caring for each other as part of an interconnected whole. So in the northeast of what's now North America, the people in the forest were intimately connected and changed in response to each other. So Buddhists call this the web of interbeing, and it comes from a paradigm of wholeness or connectedness. So the land that we live on, that our homes are on, we can partner with that in creating a resilient and diverse food ecosystem that benefits all beings. And so these are pictures from my yard at my home, and it's showing like this really kind of thrilling thing that the plants in my yard offer up each year. And I'll show you how I created this. So why would you want to do this? So a couple of you chimed in the chat, but I'll share with you some of my personal reasons, and then I'll also share some really overarching great environmental reasons to do something like this. So we have good, organic, nutrient-dense food, which is really critical to our well-being, but when we go to the store, it's very expensive. So my forest garden provides a lot of berries and a lot of fruits and hopefully soon some nuts. And now that these plants are established, I can just kind of go out and forage or do a harvest depending on what I feel like doing. And I'll be honest, like I don't really want to work that hard. Can I just ask you, is that hammering bothering anybody else?
No.
You guys are all good? You people are all good? All right. All right, so like I'm saying, like I'm actually kind of a lazy gardener with some aspects. So this forest garden, I've set it up and it now provides all this delicious, healthy food. And sometimes it's like almost like magic. So can come back from a run and be like, oh my gosh, look, the blackberries are ready, and just kind of eat a whole bunch of them. And if I can't harvest them, I can text friends and they can come and get some, or like if that doesn't even happen, the birds will come, and I love birds. So although, you know, it's producing a food forest, and you know, when I originally planned it, it was to produce food for me and my family. I really found one of the main benefits of it is increasing the connections with my friends and my neighbors and with nature. And so one of the other benefits is that many of the plants that I grow are great medicine or crafting materials. So I grow lots of herbs, I grow willow. And so again, if I decide that this year isn't the year to harvest a bunch of lavender or willow, it's fine just fulfilling its role in the garden. But that middle picture is a picture of my daughter, Magdalena. And we had harvested the first harvest of lavender in June. And I was just like, oh my God, what are we going to do with all this lavender? And she's like, I'll make a wreath, which I mean was just so great during the pandemic to have something so meaningful to make. And plus it just like made the whole kitchen smell like over the top fantastic and chill. She and I like to make baskets, so we use the willow for that. So, you know, the great thing about this is that all these plants that are in my yard, I bought them, they were teeny, teeny, tiny. And some of my family and friends that are on the call can remember how they were like these little tiny sticks, but now they've grown up. So it's pretty much all these materials and foods, it's like they're free now. And so the other thing that I've really found personally, and I think a lot of people on this call have either experienced or read about, are the benefits to our minds and our bodies and spirits from gardening. And caring for gardens, it's really enjoyable. It's a creative endeavor. It's a healthy activity. We're moving around. It increases our mobility. And getting your hands dirty in the soil, that actually causes your body to release serotonin. And serotonin is a neurotransmitter. It's one of those happy hormones that it's your body's natural way of alleviating depression. So gardening makes us happier. The microbes in the soil stimulate our immune system. It makes our gut health better. So there are a lot of personal benefits to creating a forest garden in your yard. But there are also some really, really amazing environmental benefits. And if you remember from my talk last month, there are four of the largest environmental crises. You have climate change, which is represented by the hurricane in the upper left. And so creating a food forest is going to sequester or trap more carbon in the soil than a lawn. So you're going to be mitigating climate change that way, and you're going to be buying less food that was produced far away. The other thing that a forest garden helps with is nutrient pollution, because forest gardens don't need a lot of fertilizer, so they help reduce nutrient pollution and algal blooms. Forest gardens also increase biodiversity because your yard is much more diverse. So you have the things that you're planting, which then attract other insects and birds, but you're also disconnecting a lot of your food from the industrial monoculture system, which also has an impact on biodiversity. And then the last thing, you see the picture of that person spraying in a garden or on a farm. And because you're, this food is for you and your family, you're not going to be spraying it with environmental toxins that are so harmful to us and the earth. So creating a food forest really has, in addition to personal benefits, it really has some very, very strong positive benefits. And I always imagine in my mind, like, oh my gosh, imagine my whole block just filled with this, what this could do to help regenerate my whole neighborhood. So before I go on to the next part, I just kind of want to pause for a little bit and find out if anybody has any questions before I go on. I see there's a little bit more chat. I already have a vegetable garden. Yeah. So I'll talk about that, because you wouldn't want to not have like, how else do you get tomatoes, right? So, but before I go on, does anybody have any questions or comments or? No? All right, so I'm going to share again. You know what, actually, I might have to, are you, I'm sorry I have to keep on asking this, but do you see the presentation or do you see the notes?
Presentation. Nature is design, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and now you see nature as a patterns?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right, awesome.
Yep.
Just because I'm seeing something different, but that's perfect. All right, so, you know, I keep on talking about cultivating a relationship with nature. And so one of the things to know is that nature has its own languages. And one of the languages that nature expresses itself in is pattern language. And we can use these patterns to create our designs. And when you're thinking of this aspect of creating a food forest or any landscape design, this would be like looking from the top, like the map view or the plan view. And so nature tries to increase the efficiency of a system by increasing interactions and relationships. So in the design process, this is called increasing edge, as this is where all the energy and material are exchanged, and where all the exciting change and juicy things happens. All right, but in contrast, human attempts at efficiency kind of do the opposite, because when we design systems as humans, we tend to try to optimize time as our efficiency. So we optimize time, but that usually means that interactions are minimized. So human design is usually linear or grid-like. So using nature patterns ensures that a food forest has lots of interactions and could sustain itself, and it's beautiful. And so although people have been working with pattern language since prehistory, this whole idea of biomimicry has really exploded over the last 2 decades, and it's really become a field in its own right. Like, you can get advanced degrees in biomimicry now. So I'm just going to take you through a few of the more prevalent nature patterns that are used in garden design. And just so that you know, almost all these pictures were taken from either the Smithsonian or Wikipedia websites. And That first picture is a pattern that you see over and over again, and that's the spiral. And it's kind of like the foundation of many other patterns. And so it'll help increase the amount of interactions in other patterns that I'll show you. So many times when people are starting on beginner projects, they'll start with a spiral, like a spiral herb garden or something, so that then they move on to something else. All right, and then the next pattern that's there will look familiar to most of us. It's the honeycomb or paper wasp, but sometimes it's called the bubble pattern or the 3/4 pattern. I mean, most of us would just kind of call that a hexagon. But what's interesting about that shape is that it contains the largest volume for the amount of surface area of material. So it's really, really efficient, and it gets its structural integrity because it has 3 corners coming together instead of 4 or 2. And so that's another design element that we see over and over and over again in nature, and we can replicate that because nature's worked out the efficiency for this already. And so we can trust in that'll be efficient for us as well. A couple of other patterns I'll share with you. One is the fractal pattern, which mathematically they're called infinitely self-familiar repeated patterns, but it's the kind of structure where no matter what scale you're looking at it, it's the same pattern. So whether you're looking at a teeny tiny scale or a really big scale, it looks the same. And again, we see this over and over in nature. A branching pattern would be a variation on this. And there are all these different mathematical relationships in plants. And the one that most people are familiar with is the Fibonacci series, which is the series of all the prime numbers. So a lot of plants, as they whirl their leaves around, they're arranged in the Fibonacci sequence, which is the sequence of prime numbers. So it's 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on and so on. And that's over and over again in nature. And then the bottom pattern is called the meander. And so we have a picture of a river and brain coral and lobes of an oak leaf. And these are incredibly flexible and adaptable and responsible patterns that can move and change as situations change. So rivers, they change as the environment around them changes, but then the river will also change the environment. So it's like this interesting interplay that goes on there. As the brain coral grows, it responds to the environment. And likewise with the leaf, we all know that every leaf is different, even if they're similar. And so the leaf lobe patterns will vary depending on the position on the tree or the position in the forest. And lastly is, and this isn't like I mean, there are entire books written on this subject. So I'm just showing you a few that I think will be familiar to most of us, is a wave pattern. And a wave is just a way to move energy, but we see it in matter in different ways. So if we go to the beach, we see those waves as moving water, but we also see that in plants. So the curve of a mushroom has a wave pattern. If you look at the interior structure of fruits, that also has that wave or overbeck pattern. And then waves can move matter. So that picture all the way on the right is ripples in sand that were created by wind. But that pattern can be replicated in other things like skin or bark. All right, so we can look to see what information nature is giving us and then use that to create our designs. So a little taste of pattern language there. But nature also has, so that's a pattern in space, but nature also has patterns in time. And one of the long-term patterns is a process that's called ecological succession. And this is a theoretical framework that helps us understand the changes that happens in a natural ecosystem, particularly in response to disturbance. And so this, it's really a model, but it really helps explain how land can change. So the example that I think most of us are familiar with is how farmland reverts back to a natural ecosystem over time. So we've all seen farmland that's been abandoned, or at least the farmer stopped farming it, and it gets filled with grasses and annual flowers. And so that's called the first stage of succession. So the reason that that happens is the soil is a seed bank. And okay, so you know what? I'm actually just, oh no. My computer is doing something right now, but I'm guessing that it's not happening to you. Is that correct? Can you see what's happening to my computer?
No, but we
Okay.
don't see.
So what's going to happen is I'm going to go off and then I'll come back on. This just happened to me earlier today. I'm so sorry that this is happening. Oh, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh my God!
You
wow.
didn't disappear at all.
I didn't disappear at all.
Nope.
I literally shut my computer, and from my end, I shut my computer down and restarted it.
No, you were still here.
Oh my God, that's so crazy.
Really weird, but
I am so sorry, everyone. So I'm sharing with you again, right? Yes, no?
yes.
Yes. All right. I'm so sorry to have to keep on doing that. All right. So, so in soil, there's the seed bank, and all those seeds that are in the soil, that's kind of like nature's insurance against disturbance or disaster. So, so there's a farmer that's abandoning the field, but you can also think of like the forest after a fire, or after a hurricane, or after a flood. How does the forest regenerate itself? All right, so down there in the soil, there are seeds that as soon as they're exposed, they're going to sprout up and start to cover the soil. There might be roots that allow the forest to start to regenerate itself. So that first stage of succession involves annuals, maybe some perennials. And if you're looking at the diagram, then it goes to shrubs, and then softwoods, and then a hardwood forest. And this is for where we live. Our biome is what's called the temperate deciduous forest. And so this is a traditional model of succession. And this is literally a picture out of my students' textbooks. But in reality, it's a cycle, because, you know, you look at that forest and we tend to think of it, it's in the book, it's called a climax ecosystem, which implies that it's static and eternal, but it's really not, because there's always some sort of disturbance, and then the process starts over again. And actually, you know, just as an example, what's happening right now in the pine barrens of Long Island, there's a lot of disturbance happening with the southern pine beetle. And so that forest is going through a new change of succession. And, you know, we'll see what happens to that whole ecosystem over the next decade or so. But we can use this process, we can use this framework in our gardens to ensure that we have maximum resiliency, and also think, what is our garden going to look like a decade from now, or 2 decades from now? And that's the beauty of creating an edible forest garden using the principles of permaculture, is that you're creating a system that if you abandon it and came back several hundred years later, it would still be producing food. So, so that's the time frame that we're operating at. And as you'll see, I'll share my process with you. I started in the early successional model, but the idea is to accelerate that evolutionary process to create a whole food producing ecosystem with food that I like to eat. So depending on your access to resources, you could even start a little further along in the succession process. So if you can get big trees and shrubs, you can start further on, but it really doesn't matter, because like last Sue said, nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. So you can start at any point in this model. So we're talking about working with evolution, and evolution is nature's response to change or disturbance, and biodiversity is the raw material for evolution, which is why you hear ecologists and environmentalists talking about biodiversity so much, because that's the resiliency that allows nature to change to anything that's happening in the environment. So the more diversity we put in our forest gardens, the easier our garden will adapt to any change like drought or temperature changes, or recover after a storm. All right, and so the third way that nature can inspire us is looking at the structure of forest ecosystems. So we looked from the top with pattern language. We looked over time with ecological succession, and now it's like we're kind of standing back and like taking a picture of the forest from the side and looking at the structure of the forest there. So, you know, the forest has the canopy layer way up top, you have the subcanopy, you have the shrub layer, you have the ground cover. So when you're thinking about designing your food forest, you want to think, what do I like to eat, and what role would it have in a food forest? And so you would want to structure it so that it grows up like the forest. Another thing to think about is the roots underneath, that they all need to grow and be intertwined with each other, because your plants are going to be feeding the soil microbes and organisms in the soil that are creating the soil that feeds the plants that then feeds you. So just to continue a bit on that, you know, just to remember that nature is never a monoculture, right? It's composed of groupings of plants that are supportive of each other in a mutually beneficial relationship. So the term for that in permaculture design is called a polyculture guild. Poly meaning many, culture meaning care. So the plants are put together in a grouping that's like mutually supportive. And so designing the guilds that way, with the forest structure in mind, means that you're setting up a self-sustaining ecosystem that eventually requires much less work than a modern food producing system. So although neither of these pictures have any animals in them, we all know that the forest has deer and squirrels and chipmunks and birds. I mean, there are birds in my yard, but all ecosystems have animals. I don't have animals in my yard, but traditionally in a suburban food forest, you'd have something like chickens or ducks to play that role. So, but I also want to say, to put in a little plug, if you want to learn about how this can be done on a farm size scale, like on hundreds of acres, come to my September talk where on regenerative agriculture, and I'll share this idea with you, scaled way up, that produces a lot of nutrient dense food in an economically profitable way. So that's in September, but getting back to my yard. The other thing that I should probably say is I don't produce all my food from my food forest. I mean, I don't have animals, and I eat animals, so I'll go shopping for them. But there are people who really like their design challenges, like how do I feed my whole family on a quarter of an acre? So you can go down that path too, if that kind of sparks your mind as well. So before I go on to the actual like how to, and I actually show you the story of my yard, I just want to pause again for a sec and see if there are any questions before we go on. Let's see, I see a little chat here. Okay, get inspired by others. Okay, vegetable garden. All right, so you'll see my vegetable garden, which is part of the food forest. Gypsy moss. Ugh. All right, back to sharing. Okay, and we're good, right?
Yes.
All right, so let's get into the story of how I created this food forest. So after I had lived in my home for a few years, I took this permaculture design class, and I really wanted to make a lot of changes in my life and in my yard that were aligned with my values. And also as an environmental science teacher, I really wanted to be walking the walk. I wanted to have my life be something that I could really freely talk about with my students as an example. So one of the things that I found out that I needed to do was that I needed to replace my cinder block cesspool, which was built in the 1960s. And I had to replace that with an upgraded septic system. So I did that for two reasons. One is that if I was gonna create this incredible landscape, I didn't wanna have to do that down the road. But the most meaningful part of that was that I was actually able, by doing that, to improve the water quality, the groundwater quality. So you can see that there was this huge undertaking, you know, literally ripping up the whole yard, and there's all this machinery there, and it's driving all over and compacting the soil. And you can see that after it was all done, the soil's tan, showing it has like no organic matter, and it's super compacted. So this created a real design challenge for me. And yet at the same time, I felt like if I could do that there, then, you know, I could kind of do it anywhere, and to show the power of nature's regenerative potential. So, you know, you have all this really terrible compacted soil, and I'm going to use the model of ecological succession to push my yard towards a forest ecosystem that creates abundant, delicious food. And so let me show you what I did. So I have this, you know, it really was like kind of one step removed from sand. So the first phase of ecological succession is called the pioneer phase. And that's, you know, that's mostly grasses and annual plants. And if I just let all that go, it would just be all weeds. So what I did is I planted my own early succession phase. And so I planted oats and clover to add nitrogen and organic matter to the soil. And then I also added to that mix something called daikon tillage radish. So if you think of the long radishes, the really big ones are called tillage radish. And sometimes farmers will feed them to their animals, but it has a long root, and it actually pushes through and breaks up the compaction in the soil. So I planted that so that I wouldn't need to till, I wouldn't need to break up the soil structure even more. I literally had the plants working for me. So that was the other thing that I really wanted to illustrate with my design is how do I work in partnership with plants and animals. So before you think, oh my God, that looks like a lot of work. I mean, it was a lot of work, but for this phase, all I did is I put all the seed into a spreader and walked around the yard. And I actually left for a lot that summer and just kind of let nature do my work for me. And if you look at the picture on the right, I also decided to plant some of the Three Sisters and Four Sisters polyculture, which was drawing on the agricultural wisdom of Native Americans that have been caring for this land for millennia. So these are annual polycultures where each plant has a supportive role. So in the Three Sisters, it's corn, beans, and squash. So the squash acts as a weed suppressing, moisture retaining ground cover. The beans fix nitrogen, so they're fertilizing the soil. And then the corn is supporting the beans that provides a climbing structure for them. So that's the Three Sisters. And if you add sunflowers to that mix, it's called the Four Sisters. So I planted that, and that was definitely a lot of fun. And as I'm looking at that, I'm like, maybe I'll do that next year. And so after that cover crop had done all the hard work of starting to regenerate and enrich the soil, the next year, I started to have some fun. So my kids and I started to plan what my garden beds would look like. And in a forest garden, like I said, you want to be thinking like 10 years ahead. So what do we want the final structure to be looking like? But then, and thinking of how I want to plant in my yard. So we came up with a few ideas, and we needed to create beds for those plants. And like most gardeners, weeding is something that I don't really want to be spending a lot of time doing, and I don't want the weeds competing with my plants. You know, I have a full-time job, I'm a mom, I'd rather be spending my time designing my garden and hanging out with my kids. So I use this technique called sheet mulch, and the sheet mulch that I used, actually all the sheet mulch that I used was cardboard, and there are many reasons I use cardboard. One is that you're taking something out of the waste stream and repurposing it into something that's enriching the earth. The second is that worms and other soil organisms absolutely love to eat cardboard. It's I heard someone call it like a singles bar for worms. And they take the cardboard and turn it into soil, which is really kind of amazing. So you can take this waste product and turn it into soil, which turns into plant and then turns into food. So you can look up sheet mulching. It's become a really popular technique for creating garden beds. And if you look at the diagram, it shows you can be working right on your lawn. You just cut the grass really short. If you want, you can add a little compost on top of that. Although I'll be honest, there are a lot of times I didn't even do that. I didn't even put the compost down, but it does help. And then you put the cardboard on top of that and you plant right into the cardboard. So you take a box cutter, make an X, make a hole for your plant and plant into it. And if you're seeding, you just put a layer of compost or topsoil on top of that and seed right onto that. And what you're seeing right there in that picture is something that's now a pollinator garden. And I'll take you through, eventually I'll take you through the evolution of that garden. But my daughter Magdalena designed that using a keyhole design principle. All right, so here's another picture of a small area. This is one of the first areas that I did, showing how I planted the elderberries right through the cardboard. And these are some small shrubs. I actually bought them through mail order, so they were really tiny. And I used the boxes that they came in to serve as the sheet mulch. But, you know, a lot of us get different deliveries from Amazon, so we can repurpose that to serve as sheet mulch, but also feed the soil and the organisms there. So in areas where I've created very large beds, you know, that I've just really wanted to create something very large at once, I've gone down to Rotations, which is our local bike shop, and I've gotten the boxes that bikes come in. They're enormous, and they're usually all one sheet, and you can just like lay it out and plant through that. And it's just like, it's really like an instant, fantastic looking garden. And, you know, just going back to the picture, what you're seeing is that initial planting, I think it was the spring of 2015. And what's really amazing about the cardboard is if, in this case, when I came back in the fall, the cardboard was gone. The cardboard had been turned into soil by the organisms that had already eaten it and broken it down and turned it into soil. So that's a perennial bed. And so you see the cardboard and the elderberries that I planted. And then on the right, that's the same bed 2 years later.
Wow.
So it's really, it's an amazing technique. And so that's great for perennials because kind of once you set that up, you know, you don't necessarily need to do it again, but for if you're doing an annual garden, like if you're doing lettuce and tomato, like your vegetable garden, you can do that year after year, and it just smothers the weeds. The weeds get incorporated into the garden as organic matter, and every spring you can just plant through a new layer of cardboard, and it suppresses the weeds kind of until the fall. So if you're like me and you're not really into weeding, it's a dynamite technique, and you're getting all that cardboard out of the waste stream. You know, you're turning that garbage into soil, which is, I shouldn't say garbage, the trash into soil. All right, so I just want to illustrate a couple other principles to keep in mind when you're creating your forest garden. One is that every element in your garden should really have multiple functions. All right, that's called stacking functions. So if you look in the picture on the left, And of course, it's my yard, so I know what I'm looking at, but there's actually a whole bunch of small apple trees there. And so all around those apple trees are comfrey plants. And comfrey is a great example of a plant that has multiple functions. So it's a medicinal herb, it has pretty purple flowers, it's a ground cover, it's a dynamic accumulator, and what that means is that it pulls nutrients from deep in the soil and feeds it to other plants. It acts as a living mulch. It can act as a green manure. You can make compost tea out of it. The bees love it. So it fulfills many functions in the food forest ecosystem, and it's just one plant. So, so that's definitely a useful plant. And then next to that in the same picture, there are some willows. And eventually, probably next spring, I'll make it into a fun archway to separate two rooms in my yard. But my daughter and I like to make baskets, so we can use the willow for that. It's also a natural material for fences or for hedges, which are sort of like living fence hedges. It provides shade, it provides bird habitat, it's early bee food, so it has multiple functions in my garden. And then that picture on the right shows an arbor that supports some hardy kiwi vines. So those kiwis, they don't just provide food, they don't just provide kiwi fruit, they also provide habitat, and this year it's providing a lot of habitat for hummingbirds, which has really been a lot of fun. In the spring, they have pretty flowers, they're also really fragrant, they attract a lot of pollinators, but also in the summer, they provide cooling shade. So I'm sitting under this right now, and during the day, it's like almost 10 degrees cooler in the middle of the day under this arbor than it is out in the yard. And then the kiwis are deciduous, so later in the fall, they'll lose their leaves, and then the sunlight will shine through, and that'll warm my house. So in the summer, it helps cool my house. In the winter, it allows the light in to warm my house, so it also helps reduce my home's energy usage. So, you know, there are a lot of ways that you can use different plants in multiple ways or stack functions of individual plants. So what I'm going to do right now is take you through the progression of that pollinator garden that Magdalena designed. So it starts off with this early successional cover crop. And so what she did, she laid out this garden and then put all this cardboard down on top of it. Is the cardboard coming out? Yes. And so at this point, it's coming into late spring, and I was kind of out of steam, and she definitely liked the layout part. She didn't like the planning part. So we filled it with annual plants. We filled it with zinnias that year, and they were beautiful. They attracted lots of insects and butterflies and provided a lot of color. But then the next year, I was really able to start thinking of what I wanted it to produce in terms of food. So I put pear trees on the corners to provide anchors and a foundation, divided and put some of that comfrey around them, moved some milkweed from the front to the back. And then my son got, oops, that picture's not showing up. This year, my son Ruben got into this, and that foreground area, he put in a whole bunch of new native pollinator plants that flower all the way into October. So he extended the food season for the pollinators in my yard, which was great. All right, so looking in the other direction at my septic system, I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move a little quickly through this. So we have the depleted soil. You'll recognize that first phase of succession with the three sisters. And then Ruben came up with this idea of replicating a lobe pattern I had on the other side to make an annual garden that I change every year. So those logs around there were some trees I needed to remove to put in some solar panels. So they created an edging, but now they're slowly decomposing and re-enriching the soil that's there. So what's really wonderful about this is that, so this was the next year, and then the year after that, and then this is this year, and you can see all these blueberries in the foreground. And what's great about the forest garden is that I really get food and interesting things happening all throughout the year, starting in early spring, going really until the last frost. And you know, and there's just so much flexibility and resiliency, both as a gardener, where it's like I can choose how much energy and effort I put into it, or I can allow the garden to express itself a little bit more and see what comes up. I mean, it's really been great to kind of step back and let nature be the driver in a way, and see what comes up out of that, because it's really created a lot of surprising things that I would have never thought of, and makes my garden more beautiful and abundant. And so since we're running out of time, I'm not going to take you through these other slides, except to point out that in the upper left, those dark green shrubs in the back, which started out as tiny sticks, those are hazelnuts, and it's a hazelnut hedge that hides like a sort of compost shed utility area in my yard. But we planted that because we love Nutella, but we don't like the palm oil. So I'm like, we're gonna make our own Nutella. I'm gonna grow hazelnuts. It's gonna be great. So hopefully next year I'll get some hazelnuts. So you know, I want to say thank you all for your curiosity and your attention. I know it's very different than a lot of Hampton's landscapes, but it's really it's been a wonderful journey. It's been a lot of fun, and you know, it's really opened my mind and my heart to a lot of the nature in my yard.